In my video on NLP filters, I describe the 3 filters that our brain applies to the sensory information that comes into it: deletion, distortion, and generalization. The meta model starts with our ability to recognize which of these filters people are applying from the language that they use. And when these filters lead them to make an unhelpful or unresourceful representation or interpretation of the world, if you like, a poor map of the world, then the second part of the meta model equips us to challenge those interpretations with the questions that we ask them. By asking the right questions, we can unravel some of these deletions, distortions, and generalizations. The meta model is the oldest part of NLP. It was the first model to be developed by the founders of NLP, John Grinder and Richard Bandler. They did it by observing the psychologist and family therapist Virginia Satir. She was especially good at listening to her patients and challenging the implicit assumptions in the things they said. They noticed the language patterns she used. They documented them and they unpicked them to create what we now know of as the meta model. Often, the patterns of language we use can get in the way of communicating properly, both with other people around us and with ourselves. The meta model gives us a set of patterns that we can recognize in the language people use. And once we recognize those, it helps us to identify the sorts of questions we can ask that will challenge unhelpful patterns. It's a highly technical model that takes quite a lot of study to understand fully. That's not my objective here, but let me have a go at giving you some of the basic ideas. Let's start with distortions, because these tend to be the most damaging of our filters in terms of our interpretation of the world. We distort the world in a number of ways. A common example that we hear quite often is something like, "I need to work harder." Well, who says you need to work harder? We often quote these sort of grand statements as if they were fact without any context. It may be that you do in certain contexts, but in others, certainly not. The lack of context matters. It matters fundamentally when and where you might need to work harder. And what about, "She doesn't like me"? How could you possibly know? Can you read her mind? The first of the 2 really big distortions that we make is when we assume that one thing is the cause of another effect. We can observe the effect, and then we assume we know why it happened. "He made me so angry." How could he affect the way you feel without you first interpreting the things he said and then choosing an emotion from many, many options? Whose anger is it, after all? The second important distortion is when we link 2 or more separate things as if they were equivalent, in some way the same. For example, a child might say, "Mummy won't let me have sweets because she doesn't love me." That "because" might not always be present, but it is nearly always implied. And this distortion is particularly dangerous because it is so common. We think we know the reasons for things, and we often don't. The next most important set of filters are the generalizations that quite often tend to over-dramatize a situation. "You never listen to me." Never? It may feel like this is true in the moment, but it isn't literally correct, or very rarely is. never say never. Words like always, every, none, nobody, usually are known as universal quantifiers. They almost always betray a generalization. And yes, I just used the word always. So too to what's called modal operators. Words like should, must, can't imply either possibility or necessity. Again, these are generalizations. Finally, we often delete uncomfortable information from what we're saying. When I say, I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm not telling you who or what has triggered my feelings of discomfort. And when I tell you it's because they don't understand me, I'm using that universal they that deletes who specifically I'm talking about. My own favourite is words like better, greater, improved. Better than, greater than, what? Improved over what, you might rightly ask. These kind of words often delete the things they're comparing against. And finally, we use nouns in a statement like, communication isn't working. But here, we're deleting the whole process of communicating and the people involved. But of course, without understanding the process, without knowing about the people involved, we won't find a solution to communication that isn't working. If you can start to tune your ears to listen for distortions, deletions, and generalizations in the way people around you are speaking, you can start to challenge the implicit assumptions in what they're saying that are getting in the way of either good communication or resourceful thinking. But be careful. Don't become what's known as a meta monster and challenge every single statement you hear, because it will be tempting. However, when people are making unwarranted assumptions, when they aren't thinking resourcefully, but actually need to find a solution, then the meta model can be really useful in unraveling what's going on. Please do give this video a like if you've enjoyed it or learned from it. I'll be making loads more great management courses videos for you, so please do subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of them. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and in the meantime, keep learning.